Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Center. If you're a small business owner, dynamic leadership is an exciting opportunity for you. And when I say small business, I'm talking about companies that are up to about 400 employees and or around $50 million in revenue. Of course, these numbers are a bit flexible since there are so many factors at play. Now, why use that as a benchmark? First, at that size, companies are on the verge of rapid scaling. Economies of scale can kick in, and your revenue per employee can more than double. Second, I believe dynamic leadership works best when the CEO or owner has 100% freedom of action. That's critical for the flexibility that this style offers. Dynamic leadership is a leadership style that sits on a spectrum, somewhere between servant leadership and command and control. It allows you to adjust your approach based on your needs while always keeping your long-term goals in mind. To help small business owners, I map dynamic leadership principles to Jim Collins' work, particularly his books Good to Great and Great by Choice. These books offer well-vetted and proven principles that small business leaders can trust and use without second guessing. Now, if you're familiar with these books, you'll know something about the leaders behind the companies that made the leap from good to great. What's remarkable is how they maintained above average performance for over 15 years straight. Great by Choice highlights the companies that also held strong through the 2008 financial crisis, which saw businesses closing overnight, including some of the ones that had made the cut to good to great. It's a very useful comparison and study, and it's principle based because of the way Jim Collins' team did the research. Now, these leaders all had a few things in common. They operated with a long-term vision, one that was usually bigger than themselves. They didn't prioritize short-term quarterly results just to satisfy market pressures. In my own career, I've seen a lot. As an ex-Army officer, including command over atomic munitions and completing Ranger training, I've witnessed command and control from different perspectives. In the military, it works because there is not only an entire support structure that backs it up, there are also levers that every manager and leader, no matter how low on the totem pole, has access to. A disciplinary system that scales up to essentially putting people in jail, but with many, many steps in between for a person to correct their ways. Most civilian leaders don't have anything like that at their disposal. Threat of termination doesn't even come close. Yet, command and control is a very popular style, especially amongst boards and folks who are focusing on a short-term return. And this is why I like the idea of having the CEO having full freedom of action. So they're not pushed into that direction by other stakeholders that may have some sway over them. On the flip side, as a sales manager and later sales operations executive, I experienced servant leadership firsthand. While it's a powerful tool for building trust and empowering teams, it has its limits as well. Top performers consistently leave money on the table because extrinsic motivation, it has its limits. Through my experience and research, I found that dynamic leadership is the right strategy for small businesses looking to grow and scale. It taps into something deeper, intrinsic motivation. While sales teams often rely on extrinsic motivation, things like commission checks, bonuses, and exotic trips, dynamic leadership draws its strength from leveraging the same levers that are at play for sports teams, the same kind of factors that lead to dynasty teams. Intrinsic motivation is about individuals finding joy and fulfillment in the activity and work itself, and it's more than possible. The leaders who took their companies from good to great and the ones who succeeded despite crisis fostered intrinsic motivation within their teams. In the Dynamic Leadership webinar, I unpack the skills and actions you can take to bring this style into your business. I also introduce the building blocks that make it easy to teach dynamic leadership as well as delegate the dynamic leadership process to your teams, enabling them to delegate responsibilities with confidence, and scale your leadership style as your business grows. In addition to the webinar, I'm also introducing a workshop curriculum where your leaders can get hands-on experience and start operationalizing dynamic leadership in your organization. You will walk away with the beginning of a playbook that your entire leadership team can start to follow. ensuring consistency and alignment as you grow. Welcome to this dynamic leadership overview. In the presentation that follows, I'll share why I think dynamic leadership is the ideal approach for small businesses that are growing and scaling. I landed on dynamic leadership because I wanted something that was simple, easy to understand, easy to teach, and easy to track. That was important because when growing and scaling, you want to also scale your leadership process, the same as you would with other processes and systems in your organization. It's too easy to fall into the trap of hiring the leadership team as a reaction to pressing matters. If the leadership topic gets too complex, it's going to be easy to put it off. However, the cost of not having a leadership system and a shared view of the kind of leadership you expect in your organization can create unnecessary friction and monumental problems later on down the road. Now, there are other requirements which I will share with you as we get into the presentation, but I'll tell you dynamic leadership met those requirements. As I dug into it more deeply, I found another connection that was really powerful and sealed the deal, so to speak. And that was its alignment with self-determination theory. And I'm going to start with self-determination theory today. About 3 weeks ago, I did a full episode on self-determination theory, followed that with building blocks for dynamic leadership so you can see how the different pieces fit into place. We'll cover that a little bit today as we start building the on-ramp. We're not going to be able to build the on-ramp for the entire roadmap or journey, but we'll build two, and then from there, you can start building out the others with your leadership team or with your trusted advisors. And then I followed that with a comparison or alignment with good to great, great by choice, and some tenets from built to last, and I'll refer to those today. So we're actually hitting all three of those topics. For a deep dive, I recommend going back to the beginning, which was about 4 or 5 weeks ago, where I started with the dynamic leadership series. I started with making the case for dynamic leadership, why I believe it's the best leadership strategy for a small business that is growing and scaling. The second part, from 8 to about 9, will be a working session where we're literally working through your own dynamic leadership, or at least the design of your on-ramp. I'm big on designing the on-ramp and then navigating the on-ramp to get to the steady state. Too many people try to start with steady state and then they feel like they fail because they don't get an A+ grade. They're not 100%. But if you think about it in school, that's why it's school, right? Every single class, you're building on the other one, and 70% you're still in the game. And we have to adopt that same kind of thinking. I'll make some other comparisons along the way, but let's jump into it. So I mentioned self-determination theory. And self-determination theory says that there's 3 pillars or needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And when these are met, people get intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is an important term because while people recognize that, it's motivation coming from within, what they don't recognize is that it's motivation from the task or the activity itself. So as you make the task or activity enjoyable, motivation goes up. I remember this study. They went into a city neighborhood and they paid the kids $5 for every hour that they would keep this rock in movement. They had to kick this rock, but it had to keep moving. Only a few of them actually lasted the whole hour to collect the money. Then they set up goals, and they had the same exact parameters, same exact rules. Kids lasted hours because they were playing soccer with that rock. They created the game like soccer. Whether they knew about soccer or not, they created the game with the goals, and now the activity was intrinsically motivating. This is why people can engage in gaming for hours and hours and hours, because it's intrinsically motivating. Now, why is it intrinsically motivating? Immediate feedback, and there's dopamine hits, and there's serotonin, because when you win, serotonin goes up. When you get what you want, the dopamine neurotransmitter reinforces that behavior. And when you lose, the serotonin drops. And serotonin, I say, is like the one-up neurotransmitter. So when you're doing well, you want more of it, and when you're doing poorly, you keep doing that over and over and over, you run into, I'm not going to say depression, but you get sad. And by the way, this is not about mental health at all. It's about dealing with business work. I'm spending some time on the self-determination theory because it's an important foundation of your leadership, especially as a small business owner.
Now, when you take that, what I just said, and think about video games, yes, you have some wins and you have some losses. And when you have those losses, the thing is to try to get back on top. If you watch a gambler, the same thing happens. They're winning, they want to gamble more. And when they're losing, they're trying to get back to that winning. And you can see their face just shift and shift and shift as the serotonin drops. Self-determination theory starts with two assumptions. Human beings strive for growth, so you want to have some means of them growing and developing. And then the internal sources of motivation are essential. If you look on the right side of the screen here, look at number 2 is external motivation. That's where pay comes from. And we all have seen situations where people stay in a job that doesn't pay well, or they leave a job that pays very well. The takeaway on this slide, the external motivation is not the highest form of motivation. In sales, I've spent a lot of time in sales management, and sales operations. And one of the things I'll tell you in creating incentive compensation programs for sales leaders and salespeople always leave money on the table. Managers who are paid by bonus always leave money on the table. Maybe not all the time, but if you look at the landscape, there's always people leaving money on the table. One of the cool things you can do is you have multiple incentives. You can have the pay, and then you can have the award or the trip and the recognition. That kind of feeds Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then you're going to have a higher one that kind of taps into their self-actualization. So you're hitting the incentive from different points. And what we're doing is moving that. You're looking for that group that has the capability but's leaving money on the table. You find another way to incent them. And then, like you could use inner circle, where the people get a chance to shoulder to shoulder conversate with the top leaders in the company, the CEO and the C-suite. And this is that relatedness. So we're hitting on the 3 tenets of self-determination theory with the competence. We're showing that how competent they are. We're giving them access to the top. That's the relatedness piece. And while autonomy doesn't show up as well in that example, it is that they get to make the choice. They're not told what to do. They are given the opportunity, and then they can go after it. So something to think about. It's a way to think about self-determination theory as it applies to your incentives. This thing is, I think one of the books that talks about it is 900 pages, so I'm not going to deal with it on one slide, obviously. I try to capsulize everything into one little graphic. You can see context and content is the meaning. It's unrealistic to say that you're going to build your entire organization structure around what makes the employees happy or what taps into that autonomy, competence, relatedness. And I would say that the closer you get to purpose, the closer you're getting to this environment where people can be intrinsically motivated. But it doesn't have to match their purpose 100%. See, if there's just a 10% overlap, doing something for the greater good is where you're going to find that overlap. They can frame the meaning in such a way that 10% overlap is enough. It's enough to tap in to that purpose, and that's going to help you with the intrinsic motivation. And then tapping into the basic psychological needs, and think in terms of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if what you're about to do builds on these 3 or detracts from these 3. And if you have employees who are unhappy, you can pretty much talk to them and within 5 minutes find out which one of those 3 is missing. Then we have internal motivation. Extrinsic is low, intrinsic is high. That's the same slide, basically the same message I said before. And then consequence and engagement, feeling, understanding, and behavior. People need to be seen. They need to feel like they're making the choice. Even when I talk to salespeople about their sales process, you want to sell in a way that people want to buy, and you have to let them feel like they're making the choice. So a close is really not you closing them. The close is really helping them get past their own inhibitions about making that purchase. So as I said, intrinsic motivation is incentive from the activity itself. Extrinsic is incentive other than the act itself. Motivation is an internal force that comes from personal responsibility and belief. People are driven by their own interests, values, and passions, but that doesn't mean there has to be a match. If you watch gaming behavior, people will play whatever game is available to them. It doesn't have to be their favorite game. You come up with the game that's number 10 on their list, but if they can game, they're going to game, right? And you can use that example over and over and over. Skiers, and snowboarders, they may not be able to go to their favorite snowboard park, but whatever park is available, they'll go to that park and they'll do it again and again and again. So this is that point I'm making, is you don't have to be a 10 out of 10 on the what, as long as they can get that experience out of it. And then you can't motivate others, you can't inspire them to find their own motivation. That's an important point. I think most people would agree with that. Intrinsic motivation, enjoyment from the activity itself. You see connection to purpose. I mentioned that. Find that overlap. And think about that example that I'm using of it may not be the best video game, but it still gives them that experience. Autonomy, competence, relatedness. And that's what's nice about dynamic leadership and you using self-determination theory, just those three things. I could take a brand new person to the company, a person brand new to leadership, and ask them questions. Does this thing add to autonomy, competence, relatedness? Does this thing detract? I give them scenarios and say which one is missing in here. How can you add it? And they can figure it out because people know how to do this. This is what we do in real life, right? Outside of work. And then the internal need to grow and attain fulfillment. And this taps into this dopamine. And I'm going to talk about this towards the end where I get into the observable behavior, because you don't want to just tell people what to do. You want to benefit from the conditioning. When sports teams play, they don't sit around and talk about the plays. They get out there and they condition them. They condition them. They condition them. You would say, yes, they're building muscle memory. It's not muscle memory, it's nervous system memory. We don't call it that, but it's nervous system memory because the muscles don't have the impulse. It's the nervous system that sends the signal. The nervous system is the same nervous system that decides what we should say. It decides our facial expressions. It decides what we're going to do. That nervous system memory, the same way that sports teams condition their players, is how we can condition ourselves to perform. Implementation tensions is one way we do that. Implementation tensions are thinking, if this happens, I'm going to do this. It's sort of future pacing. So you're creating associations out into the future. The same way on the playing field in practice, they create associations. The opponents do this, you do that. Opponents do this, you do that. And they condition the behavior. Once you've conditioned the behavior, you're no longer relying on management and supervising to tell them what to do. They're doing the behavior itself. And this is why I talk about a 2-year development plan. A new player doesn't start with all of the plays all at once. They build on the plays and then they add to them and then they add to them. Having a thoughtful development plan enables that. Why intrinsic motivation? People access their best version of themselves. It's easier for people to maintain a growth mindset. Extrinsic motivation requires resources and time that are not necessary when you have intrinsic motivation. And then people are happier when intrinsically motivated. Increased engagement, higher job satisfaction, improved productivity, reduced turnover, fosters innovation, consistency, and performance, all the things that we want. So why isn't dynamic leadership talked about? Why don't we say more about this thing? Why is it, a thing? Obviously, if it's so powerful, why aren't more people doing it? Why am I just now hearing about it? Now, you can Google dynamic leadership, and what you're going to find is that there's very little structure around it because it's extremely situational. It's more situational than situational leadership, in my opinion. The same way that a person in your company, think about this, people in your company, they plan vacations, they fly around the world, they spend a week in a country or 2 weeks in a country where they don't understand the language, and they get along just fine. They don't need to check in with you to find out what to do, where to eat, how to handle this problem, how to get through customs. They figure it out. They're adapting to whatever situation is thrown their way. And what's interesting about going on vacation in a foreign country is that while there are a lot of things that are the same, there are a lot of things that are different. And so you're not into this automatic click whir kind of mentality. You're actually having to engage your conscious thinking. The connection there, you look at some of my other events, because dynamic leadership goes along with personal leadership. You first have to have personal leadership and agency, and then you can have the dynamic leadership. To try to do dynamic leadership without the personal leadership and without having the agency, it's going to be a lot more difficult because you're going to be reacting to internal feelings, internal emotions, and those are going to get in the way. This connection that I'm making about the example of going into a foreign country, people are having to pause. They're not having to just rely on their automatic nervous system response. They're actually having to pause, which is a big part of getting into personal leadership, because you're inserting a pause between your reaction and your response. We don't want the reaction to equal the response. I say a lot more about that. You can go into my event section, and I call it high performance self-coaching. You look at one of those videos. Do more of the left side and do less of the right side. This is motherhood and apple pie. We know this. It makes sense. And again, why isn't dynamic leadership talked about? I already alluded to one of the reasons. One of the reasons is that there's no structure around it. The other reason I would say, and this probably is more important, is that I want you to experience this. So I want you to read this slide and read it from the perspective of an employee and see how it makes you feel. So as an employee, it probably makes you feel good. You're like, yeah, I like this. This is the way it should be. And yes. Now I want you to read it as a CEO who was put in charge of a company by a board. And the board told this CEO that they have to hit these targets by this date in a year. If they don't hit these targets by this date in a year, then they're out. And by the way, the board also put in place the senior leadership team. So the whole C-suite was put in place by the board, meaning that these are their guys. And now the CEO comes in, and the CEO has to get this done in a year or they're out. Now read it as that person. So you can see the challenge, hopefully, with servant leadership in that, yes, it's good for the employee and the team member. But when it comes to the board and that CEO who was put in place by the board, I don't know if I have the patience to do that. That seems like it might take a long time. That's a long-term play. And we're dealing with quarters here and maybe a year. And of course, public corporations, their numbers are looked at quarter to quarter. And some of your best performing organizations based on great by choice. So Jim Collins, Built to Last, Good to Great, and then Great by Choice. One theme through all of those is these people did not fall prey to the quarterly numbers and that quarterly metric. Sure, they still had to report, but they didn't worry about what this decision was going to do to their quarterly numbers. They made the right decisions for the organization. And this is an important point here because as a small business owner, and that's who this is for, small business, as I've talked about in previous events, somewhere around up to 400 people about. And the reason I use 400 people is because after that, there's too many complexities or potential complexities because of what I'm talking about, like with the board and et cetera, and other stakeholders. You have investors who care more because we're talking about a lot more money. The other thing that happens is the urgency actually is lower above that because you have your revenue per employee can as much as double for companies with more than 400 employees compared to companies with less than 400 employees. Of course, it's more of a continuum. But when you have 2 and 3 times the revenue per employee, you can make a lot of mistakes. You can have a lot of people sitting around doing nothing while you're waiting for the next big thing. That small companies don't have that luxury. So that's why I use the 1 to 400. It doesn't mean that dynamic leadership won't work in a larger organization, but there are some hurdles that you may have to clear, especially time. And I would say one of the things, if you're that CEO and that board, I think the condition I would put in place is, as back to them, my counter would be, okay, that's time out. Here's the areas I need freedom of action. I'm going to do it this way, in this area, and this way. And by the way, this is going to take more like 18 to 24 months because this is what we're dealing with. It was kind of screwed up, which is why you're bringing me in. And the reason it's screwed up is because of this, this, and this. And that doesn't turn around in 9 months. It turns around more like in 18. So we need to take these metrics and move them out to, you know what, I would create that frame if you're in that situation. Or you don't, it's either win-win or no deal. If you can't get to a place where you feel, because here's the thing, after a year when you're on the hot seat and they're telling that CEO, you're out of here because, and they say, yeah, but this, and yeah, but it doesn't fly. It's over. That ship has sailed. You've got to set that up on the front end when you have some leverage. And then once you create your bubble of what you can do, now you can do the dynamic leadership. So that I bring that out because you can still do it if you're in a situation with a very powerful board. When I say powerful board, I'm talking about in the context of they put all the leaders in place. And so basically, you may take exception with me saying this, but I would say if you look at a CEO of a 400-person organization, privately owned, they're the owner, they have some mastermind groups that help them out, but they're making the decisions. That is a true leader. When you're looking at, and again, I'm going to get some pushback on here, but when you look at leaders who are put in place by a board, the entire team was put in place by the board gives them the strategy, it's almost like those leaders are managers. And I think this is why we have some challenges when it comes to looking at leadership styles, because there's an element of leadership, and if you're a small business person who needed to make payroll, you understand what I'm talking about. There's an element of leadership that some corporate players will never experience. And this needs to be addressed when we start talking about leadership approaches. If you read this one from the employee standpoint and see how it makes you feel, just notice how it makes you feel. Now, I want you to read it as that CEO who was put in place by the board, and the board also put in place the C-suite team, and by the way, the board also put in place the strategy. Now read it as that person. You probably notice that it fits much better with that CEO who is being driven to complete certain tasks and hit certain metrics within a very short period of time. That's why people like command and control. But hopefully in that little exercise, you've noticed how these can be at different ends of the continuum and why command and control still will always prevail and why servant leadership will always be rejected by some. So some will always lead with command and control, and some will always reject servant leadership, and it's because they don't serve the entire continuum. They're ends of a continuum, and somewhere in the middle is where it works, and that's why I like dynamic leadership. So take a read of that one. You can see that this one has a more adaptive feel to it. It's more about the situation. You know, if you take a sports team, there are some players where the coach is like on their case over and over during practice, during this drill, and then in another drill, they're not even paying attention to them. They're on this player's case over and over and over because they're fixing whatever's broken. They're adapting to what's broken. They're not treating everybody as one. And I've read this thing years ago, and I actually live by it. It says treating everybody the same is the highest form of discrimination. And it's because you're not seeing the people. You're not implementing what makes sense for them at the time. You're treating everybody the same. And we've all seen this. And if you're in sales, you've definitely seen this, that you're a high producer and you're having to live with the same rules and requirements that some of the lower producers have to live with, and it just doesn't make sense to you. Why you haven't, and it drives high producers crazy, which is why you want to have levels. I think if you have a senior account executive and an account executive and different, and a lot of companies will do that, but understand that at the highest levels, that top 3 to 5%, that is very unique. You can't teach that. What they bring to the table, you don't teach. You can inspire. But now, by having a different label for these people, a different level, where they have more autonomy, right? And it's based on their competence. And then there's the relatedness. They have an inside track. Now you can actually get this top group to go even further because they're not held back by the lack of relatedness and feeling of competence, and especially autonomy. You take autonomy away from somebody, and they're going to go play video games to get that release. People are going to get that release. They're going to get that connection somehow. For others, it's gaming. For others, it might be horseback riding. For others, it might be going to sports events. Whatever it is, they're going to get that. But the more you can apply it and the more you can give it to them in the workplace, the better off you're going to be. So best practices, that little exercise that we went through, Best practices are based on the desired outcome. The best practice in some cases, they support autonomy, competency, relatedness. Best practices in other instances, they hinder autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So you can see how there can be best practices coming out of command and control. And sometimes they're the right thing to do, but sometimes they hinder it. Let me just talk a little bit, because I spent some time as a military officer, and I didn't go through military school. I went through officer candidate school. So 14 weeks, they got me from an enlisted person to an officer, and I was 24 years old. And as I became an officer, I signed for $2 million worth of earth moving equipment. I had a combat heavy earth moving platoon, so I had scrapers and 5 20-ton dump trucks, 2 bucket loaders, 3 bulldozers, graders, water trucks. You get the picture, scrapers. I signed for $2 million of equipment as a 24-year-old, and 80% of the people I was leading were older than me and had much more experience than me, because I went straight through in basic and then advanced and then officer school and then airborne and then ranger. So I was younger than most of the people in the organization that I was leading. I was the platoon leader. Later on, I became a commander, etc. My point being that command and control worked because they taught us what to do, and they had a frame. So within my frame, I had freedom of action. I had autonomy within my frame. And this is how the leaders develop in the Army. This is why back in the day, the corporations loved to get people from the military, because they had this development. They loved military officers and non-commissioned officers as well, because they had this leadership structure that they understood. And that's why I think command and control, at least in the US, found its way into the fabric of a lot of organizations. But my point is, command and control worked because there was a combination of direction and rules, but also autonomy. And remember, in the military, we were training all the time. If you didn't have a mission, you were making up a mission. You were out in the field doing training constantly. That was the work. The work was training. So you want to know how Navy SEALs and Army Rangers can be so precise when they go on these missions? It's because they're constantly training. There's other reasons as well. They basically have conditioned a different set of reaction response for these folks. But I'm pointing that out because, yes, command and control can work. But if you don't have that entire structure, the freedom of action, the real, and also there was a hefty penalty system in there. I could use Article 15s. I could take pay from people if I wanted to. I could suspend pay. I could take the Article 15 and put it out there, but not execute it and give them 90 days. And if they didn't improve in 90 days, then it would execute. So that had many, many levers that I can pull that don't work in the civilian sector, because they're just kind of severe and they create lawsuits. So if you're using command and control, but you don't have all these levers, you're probably not going to. And then what it takes is a charismatic leader to make it all work. The charismatic leader comes in, but you can't train that. I mean, you can, but most people don't have the tools to train that to be a charismatic. It's a conditioning. It's not teaching. You have to condition the behavior. Anyway, back to the point, command and control will have its limitations, and it requires other tools that most small businesses are not putting in place. So if you're using a command and control, it's not working. I can tell you that already, and you're probably looking for why it doesn't work. If you're using servant leadership, it's probably not working because you're not getting the compliance that you need. Dynamic leadership can fit that. So here's a quick comparison to start to make this point further. So as you see across the top, the aspect, what it looks like from command and control, what it looks like from servant leadership, and then using that same aspect but with dynamic leadership. And you can see it, top-down, centralized control, collaborative, bottom-up. You need a combination, adaptive. It moves between top-down. And this is why I'm saying you don't see a lot of teaching material in dynamic leadership, because it's not cut and dry. It's not a quick rules-based thing. You have to look at the situation. And so it doesn't serve maybe I shouldn't say it this way, but it doesn't serve the universities well, because how do you do an entire curriculum? How do you do, advanced degrees on dynamic leadership when it requires the situation? But that's essentially what goes on in the Army when you're constantly training, or the combat arms, I should say. The leader's role, authority figure, directive. And see, this authority taps into cognitive biases. There's a lot of cognitive biases at play when you look at the leadership style. And that's why I wanted something that was simple. Because when I first started this journey 4 years ago to put this into a package, I thought I was going to be talking more about cognitive biases. But the challenge is cognitive biases is such a vast area, and they're different for each person, and trying to understand all of that, it turned out to be a non-starter. But understanding cognitive biases allowed me to create my framework that replaces the typical stimulus response. And by replacing that framework, I literally address the situation of cognitive biases in that structure. In other words, I take them out of play. And the program, you actually go through the personal leadership and agency. And I don't care where you are. There's more personal leadership and there's more agency, because no one is 100% in charge of their subconscious. And then once you become in charge of your subconscious, now you have personal leadership and now you have agency. It's the being before you go after the having, the be, do, have versus the have, do, be. And then once we have that personal leadership and agency in place, and it could be 3 to 6 months, and then we get into the dynamic leadership. And the dynamic leadership is now you can pull those levers, and you're not being driven by your own internal reactions, your own insecurities, your own fear and greed. Gain a benefit, greed at the extreme. Avoid a loss, fear at the extreme. And these create other problems because you have conditioned responses, conditioned reactions, etc. And then another one, goal orientation, immediate tasks, short-term goals. There's that quarterly thing, right? Long-term relationships, growth of individuals in the team. And then dynamic leadership is more ambitious. It's forward-looking. It moves toward large visionary goals. And I'm going to say something here, because one of the themes that you'll hear me consistently talk about is using a team metaphor versus a family metaphor, or versus some other metaphor that might fit. Political, bureaucratic, friend group. Team metaphor is the one that works for me, because team, it embodies all the pieces that you need. And I'll have a couple of slides in a moment that get into that. What I like about team metaphor in the workplace is that there's no opponent. So teams have to do that because there's an opponent constantly in their face. Every week they've got a game, or every few days they have a game. And that opponent is trying to stop their every play. Whereas in business, you have competitors. You may have opponents who go out there and hit your links to kind of exhaust your ad spend. And, those games are played. And, yes, so you do have some of that opponent behavior, but it's not an everyday thing where they're in your face trying to stop your every play. These opponents that sports teams face, they watch the reels, they know the weaknesses, they know the tells, and they're able to put plays together designed specifically to stop the play of the team that they're going to play that weekend. Where in business, our competitors don't have that view, and they're focused on their own strategy. There's nothing stopping them. And this is why I can realistically talk about 10x. And I do this illustration in other events, but essentially once you get past the noise and you get up above here where there's free running, you have no opponents other than what's coming from inside. And that's why we do the personal leadership and agency, because we want to eliminate those internal opponents that are occurring. And as a leader, you learn to neutralize those internal opponents that people bring to the table. It's not the scope of this conversation, but just know that there's a way to get past that. There's no opponent, so 10x becomes within reach. Sometimes in organizations, they put their own internal opponent in there just because they need to have something to go against. They need an internal opponent. Your opponent is the natural resistance to you doing 10x. This is why when somebody's trying to do 1.5x or 1.3x, 1.7x, it's sometimes more difficult than to just say, we're going after 10x or 5x or whatever that number. Because Now it's all of a sudden the goal is big enough to make you want to get out of bed on a bad day of a bad week. I could say more than that. Just let that sit for a while and think about it in terms of the team metaphor, and then what you could do to implement some gamification without creating internal opponents. There's different things that you can do to move that action. And then here's the example of the employee journey roadmap. And this has about, 12, 14 elements. Employee journey roadmap. So early engagement and onboarding. And this is not the orientation. I actually separate that out. There's other items above this. One item above the onboarding, and that is the orientation, which I look at more of the HR. That's more of how you get paid and how the working in the organization unfolds, etc. If you think about a team, there's the administrative part of the orientation, and then there's the playing part of the onboarding. So this is the playing part of the onboarding. In the second hour today, I'm going to work with you to design your own early engagement onboarding, your own task assignment and responsibility, and then your own feedback and development and coaching. All right. So here's some leadership examples. You can take screenshots of these, but the building the right team, first who, then what. And this is from the good to great. Coaches prioritize talent selection, just like Jim Collins. First who, then what. Bill Belichick, New England Patriots, emphasizes picking players who fit within the system and have the right mindset, echoing how dynamic leaders focus on getting the right talent to fit their organization's culture. So you can use these slides as you think about designing your own on-ramp, because these coaches took their framework. And in this case, the business model would be like playing football. In the case of Belichick, playing football and going after the Super Bowl was the target. And then within that, he used his own freedom of action to decide his strategy. So your business model can be what it is. Your vision is what it is. The business model might change 2 or 3 times on the way to its vision, right? That's the blockbuster Netflix conversation. The idea was the vision is the same, but the business model may be different. And then to achieve the business model, you can change your operating model over and over and over. The operating model is like the playbook, as an example, as a way to think about it. So you don't have to say this operating model matches that business model. You don't need a plan B. We're talking about the vision. You're staying with that vision because it's the right one to do. The business model might change. I don't think it's going to change every year, but the business model may change 2 or 3 times over an evolution of a company. But the operating model can be very adaptive. And having a dynamic leadership approach, you can imagine this idea where you're changing some parts of the operating model while the other parts are still operating the same way. And then as this stabilizes, now you can change other parts of the operating model, and you're constantly evolving with your company. Next one, adaptability in volatile environments is great by choice, specific, methodical, and consistent. So Putnam, I think it's Howard Putnam, Southwest Airlines, he was one of the companies that made the cut from good to great by choice, because he was able to keep getting those high performing results after the volatility of the economic crisis in '08. And that's essentially the book's Good to Great looked at these companies that were for 15 years able to get these outsized results compared to the comparison companies. And then after the financial crisis, some of those companies just literally disappeared. And then what Jim Collins and his team did, they went and looked at which companies sustained it even after the thing, why some companies disappeared, other ones kept going, and Southwest was one of the ones that made the cut. And his specific, methodical, and consistent was he would only use 737s, for example. They were fast turnaround. He only had to have one kind of simulator, one version of training manuals. All his pilots could fly all the planes. So he had a very specific, methodical, consistent approach. So all the VUCA around him, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, it didn't matter. It didn't affect him because his approach was so consistent. And that's what I talked to you guys about. And the example here is Chicago Bulls did it, Phil Jackson, but Los Angeles Lakers, they were also known for this triangle offense, which basically moved the players around into these triangles. And they always knew where their teammates would be, because they would have a guy move from the weak side of the court to the strong side. But it always was creating these triangles. And so they always knew where to pass, and it made it very difficult for the other team to double team. these are just like I'm changing my operating model. The business model is still the same. It's get to the NBA playoffs. It's become the champion. The operating model will be different. Fanatic discipline. This is from Out of Great by Choice. This was the two guys were going out to the Arctic on expeditions, and one of them did 20 miles a day, no matter how good the conditions were, how bad the conditions were. Sometimes he didn't quite make the 20 in these really severe blizzards, but they did everything they could to get that 20. And then things were good. They didn't do 30 miles to make up. They did 20 every day, 20 every day. And then he built into his plan that he knew there would be some misses. But this is like that 100% versus 70%. Just because you hit 70% today or 85% today doesn't mean you have to make it up the next day. It's just sometimes you don't get the A on the test, right? But that 20 miles per day, and that's where the 20, and you can look up this 20-mile march, and it shows up in a lot of different places. And in this case, the Alabama football coach, importance of focusing on the process, always the process, always the process. And he didn't worry about deviating their preparation. Different strategies, fire bullets than cannonballs. This comes from Great by Choice. And the idea is that you test, and I love the example because in small business today, one of the huge advantages small businesses have is that they can test over and over and over. Like I talk about ClickFunnels. ClickFunnels is on its way to being an enterprise solution. And so even if you have a web developer and a huge website and several $100 million company, you can still have ClickFunnels running inside. 8 o'clock, come up with an idea. 10 o'clock, your ClickFunnels can actually have A/B testing out with consumers in 2 hours. It's a very powerful tool to do the bullets and then cannonballs because you can test and test and test. And you're not interacting with your developers. You're not having to spend money. You're not having to have these design requirement meetings. You just decide, here's what we want to say. And then while it's going, they could literally change the A/B testing on the fly. This is working. What if we change that? Now you do ABC testing and just keep scaling up. You can literally do this for 2 or 3 days, get a sense of how it's working, and then decide, do we want to do this or not? Greg Popovich, San Antonio Spurs. I like this example. He would try new combinations and offensive strategies during the regular season before solidifying them in the playoffs. Think about this. He is priming them. Every day they're talking about these things because when they get to the playoffs. These things because when he is priming them. So basically, over time, the playoffs is not even a question of they're going to make the playoffs. It's which plays are going to make the cut for the playoffs. Very, very powerful tool. And when you look at life from a conditioning standpoint, these things are fascinating. And then we have creating a winning culture, preserve the core, stimulate progress. And this is from Built to Last, build a strong team culture. Winning coaches cultivate a culture that defines what their team stands for. It's not about politics, right? It's not about favoritism. It's about having this thing that's bigger than everybody. John Wooden, he established a team culture based on values of teamwork, hard work, and integrity. His pyramid of success was both a framework for preserving core principles and stimulating continuous growth. One of the things that John Wooden is known for is at the beginning of the season, he would teach his players, the first practice was how to tie their shoes. Now, the logic is that you didn't want your shoes to come loose and you didn't want to get blisters. But imagine your organization having a 2-year development plan for every employee. I don't care if they're an experienced leader or an entry level. Obviously, the development plans would be very different, and one might have 24 touches in 2 years. The other one might only have 6 assessments or 4 assessments in 2 years or 2 assessments, things that they've got to do because they have the experience. But imagine a development plan that is taking into consideration things like tying your shoes. And what does that look like in your organization? And that's, by the way, why I'm showing you these examples. So as you start to build your own on-ramp, you do it based on what you want. You have the autonomy in the agency to do it the way you want, and then what you're going to teach your other leaders to do. So I don't care how much experience they come to you with. You can have them go through your development plan. Emotional intelligence, player development, self-determination theory. We said quite a bit about that. Connecting with and developing individuals. Great coaches understand that they need to connect with each player. Steve Kerr is known for his ability to manage diverse personalities. Phil Jackson did this as well in the Dennis Rodman, Scottie Pippen, Steve Kerr, Michael Jordan days. He had all these unique personalities and he was able to get them to work because he saw each person and he didn't have them competing against each other. He had them competing against becoming their best version of themselves. I've talked about this before. 3 examples of supporting intrinsic motivation. And I'm covering this one because now we're going to get into using this project template. And I hope you download the project template, because on the second part of it, I have the roadmap and the journey that you can use. I also have the comparison between command and control and servant leadership. So on this slide, I have 3 boxes. The first box says feedback, observation based. So in this way, I'm talking about feedback should as much as possible be observable. I call red, white, and blue language. Blue language is observable. When you use observable feedback, I like the way you did X, Y, and Z because it led to A, B, C, whatever. As opposed to you're doing a good job. You're doing a good job would be red language. Describing the behavior takes a few more words. That's blue language, because you're actually tying it to a specific behavior. They did this and you did that. That was exactly what we want. That's blue language. And then white language is describing what's not there. You didn't do this. You didn't do that. You weren't present at the meeting. It doesn't look at what you were doing. There's a billion things anybody on any given day is not doing, and telling them what they're not doing is not a way to motivate them, because it doesn't give them any direction of what to do. So that's the observation-based feedback. 3-to-1 ratio. That's talking about 3 positives or praises for every 1 reprimand. And we're not talking about praising and reprimand in the literal sense, but you want to give 3 acknowledgments of good work, good feedback for every 1 that's going to be some kind of a reprimand. And the way you do that is by using observation-based feedback, and by using a long-term development plan. You have the opportunity to always be giving feedback. And you can always give your feedback in the context of a start, stop, continue format, which is going to be, it's like a positive sandwich, right? Like a praise, reprimand sandwich in a way, start, stop, continue. But the development plan gives you the context for having these conversations. Growth mindset, you want simple things like using the word yet. Yeah, you're not quite there yet. That fosters a growth mindset. You're not doing it, we don't quite have it yet. That fosters a growth mindset. Versus you didn't do it, you failed, it didn't work. Of course, that's also white language. So you want to use that yet. And then checkpoints. I think checkpoints, we're leaving money on the table because we don't have them. A lot of companies don't have checkpoint meetings at all. In California, there's such a high bar to become a salaried worker, an exempt employee, that we have people literally managing stores, major stores, and they're hourly workers. And so hourly workers tend not to get checkpoint meetings. I don't know why that is what it is, and then other companies look at checkpoint meetings as something that are for when people are doing poorly. They're on a performance management plan. First of all, I would say a performance management plan is not a negative. A performance management plan, I know how it's talked about, but a performance management plan is, we're going to manage performance and make it better. That's why we have the development plan. Checkpoint meetings are a way to talk about the development plan and the progress and the next level and taking the next steps. Imagine a sports team that never had practices. Imagine a sports team that had practice but never had feedback. Now, you don't have a game every week in your business, but what I would say is that you have opportunities that show up every once in a while, and those are your opportunities to make major ground on 10X. And that's the big game for you. And you don't know when those big game moments are going to show up. So we want to keep building that team and preparing them, and that's when the stakes are highest. We've all had those existential crisis feeling moments, and that's what you're preparing these people for. And then rewarding the desired behavior. So this is conditioning. You would never expect a sports team to rely solely on telling the players what to do. They condition it. They condition the behavior. And by the way, the reason why blue language is so important is because it literally conditions the behavior. You see, when I use red language, you did a good job. We're attaching the language, we're attaching the good feelings, the dopamine, the serotonin boost that comes from that. It's getting attached to me as the leader. And so when I'm not around, we don't know what that person is going to be doing. When you have blue language, it's attached to the task. It's attached to the behavior. Now the dopamine release and the serotonin boost is attached to that behavior. It's like the gamification. It's like why the people can do gaming for hours and hours. You're literally improving the intrinsic motivation by using blue language. So that's rewarding the desired behavior with blue language, a conversation with relatedness. It also helps with the self-determination theory, right? Because the competence and relatedness get tapped there. Then the next box I have is empowerment. Progressive And this is the developmental plan. We want to have something that's progressive, always building on, getting better, capability based. So we're looking at what they can do. We're not just training everybody the same. You're doing an assessment of what people need. And I have a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 format. Now this is kind of generic, but if you think about it, if I give an assignment, I want to have a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So this week we're going to meet 5 days. Next week we'll meet 4 days. The following week it'll be 3, then 2, then 1. But that can also be in 1 week. You say today with this new task, we're going to meet 5 times today. This hour, this hour, this hour, to get them to make sure they're doing it right. Then tomorrow we're going to meet 4 times. Then we're going to meet 3 on Wednesday, then 2. Or you can do it months. You can do it over a month. We're going to meet 5 times this month, and then the next month we'll meet 4 times. Whatever it is, it depends. My point is that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you're recognizing the fact that people are not going to come out of the chute 100%. I talked about this before, right? You've got to have this latitude to develop and get better. That's where the growth mindset comes in, because you're rewarding effort and activity, not just the result. This 70% is passing in school, and then all of a sudden we hit work and it's 100. 100 is it, and anything else than that you're losing. We want to get away from that, and that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 acknowledges that there's a growth track that has to hit. Aligned with strengths. So empowerment should be aligned with strengths. Everybody should not get the same level of empowerment. You want to empower people based on what their strengths are, and that's getting back to the competence and the autonomy of the self-determination theory. Having freedom of action, that's the autonomy. But again, everybody doesn't have the same level of freedom of action. You hear a lot of situational basis that I'm using because that's what dynamic leadership is about. And I'm going through this now because it sets the stage for where we're going to go as we start building on the project planning. And then we have including development. So I have made the statement, I'll make it over and over again, that companies should have a 2-year development plan for their employees. Now, for some employees, that might be 24 touches. For other employees, like experienced leaders, it might be 3 or 4 touches in 2 years. But if you consider what goes on in the military, in combat, they're always training. They're constantly training. There's always another level to go to. That was the reason I brought up the John Wooden, tying your shoes at that level of granularity. So yes, they have leadership experience, but I want to train them. I want to develop them based on what we need. And development can have things like, presenting to this level of group, or another one might be working through a succession plan for their team. Another one could be conducting a checkpoint meeting for a high performer, conducting a checkpoint meeting for a person who needs improvement. Another one could be conducting a year-end appraisal. Now, some of these might be just checks, right, where an experienced leader knows how to do the appraisal, but you also might pick up 1 or 2 things that they may be doing wrong. Remember, leaders come to us from different metaphors. They could come from a family metaphor. There were no appraisals. They might come from a command and control metaphor where it's all about, fear, motivation. So even though they know how to do a year-end appraisal, they may not do it the way your organization is doing, which is based on a team metaphor. So here's where we're flexing that nuance a little bit, and we're doing it early on in the development plan so that we're all on the same page. So definitely including development. And then the third box is checkpoints. And an easy format, if you've never done checkpoints or you don't do checkpoints, I would start with, first of all, do it about yourself. Start with a start, stop, continue. And I would start this with high-performing employees that you have a good relationship with, so you can get your own comfort. You need reps, right? The first time you do it, you're going to be it's going to be probably a little bit rough. You'll also find that when you do it with some employees, they really kind of resist this. So you need to do some reps and get comfortable with it. But in the context of building a high-performing organization, what are some of the things I can do as a leader to support you to move in that direction? What are some of the things that as a leader I should start doing? What are some of the things as a leader I can stop doing that may be getting in the way? And then what are some things I can continue doing? So it's that praise, reprimand sandwich, so to speak. And then do it with them. After you've done that with yourself a few times, then you start doing it with them. And I would always do both. In a checkpoint meeting, I would do that. I would do myself first. It's like a live 360, right? What can I start doing? What can I stop doing? What can I continue doing? And what often happens, the things that I was going to talk about with the employee about what they could improve, I'm causing some of the problem. And so their start and their stop and their continue actually gives me feedback that says, ooh, I'm creating the friction point that's causing the thing that they're having trouble with. easy enough. Just remove the friction point. It was surprising to me how often that was the case. And it's because I'm solving problems as they're coming up. And I'm not recognizing their model of the world. Like they may have a model of the world that says, this is how I do this. When this happens, I do that. When that happens, I do this. And I've got this thing in place that was put in for some other reason, and it's getting in their way. So having that conversation is a two-way. And then from there, once you're comfortable with that start, stop, continue approach, you can start expanding your checkpoint meetings. There's different forms you can use. Again, as a leader, you can come up with your own way of doing it. But I would always go back to the team examples or the team metaphor, and that's why I gave you those slides of the approaches that different coaches. Two-way feedback, so that's the live 360. I also recommend doing full 360s if you can, if your organization allows it. Definitely do some full 360s. I would do Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs is a real eye-opener. The biggest area of breakdown in organizations tend to be in the N and the S dimension. So N is the intuitor, S is the sensor, and it's almost breaks down in terms of operational excellence versus project excellence. And one group wants to change things, the other group wants to keep things the way they are. And it's the biggest breakdown in business or in organizations. And by organizing your teams in such a way so that you have both represented makes a lot of sense, especially as you're thinking about projects. So projects, I probably would have more N's, but I need some S's in there to keep me grounded. And in the operational, I'm probably going to bias more towards S's, but I need some N's in there to look for opportunities for improvement. You can also use it with your listening. If you know you're talking to an N, you know they're biased towards improving things, and you may have to cut the deck a few times. When I was building high-performing teams, I had a new team to build every 2 years because the way the work was structured. I always had my senior leadership team go through Myers-Briggs. We did it together. So I've gone through Myers-Briggs probably 7 or 8 times through the whole thing. So I wanted to go through with the leadership team. And then we all understood each other's strengths, and we understood our propensities, et cetera, and that applied. And then the checkpoint meetings should feed the annual review. I also put in there developmental, so checkpoint meetings have to be developmental, where here's where you are, here's what we need to be doing. You're not here yet in this area, and here's what's next. And always building this next. And that's sort of a gamification, because it's like gating. Imagine training a kid to ride a bicycle. First, you want them to ride and pedal fast enough with training wheels, or with you holding a seat, and then they have to learn how to get the bike to balance and steer. So you keep them on the sidewalk for a while, and then when they get good enough, you let them go in the street, just in this area or just on your block, and then next thing you know, they can go around the block. So it's that same developmental thing, and it's a gamification. So they're motivated to get better at steering. They're going to start showing you how they could turn into the driveway and at a high speed, and how they could do all these things because they want to earn that right to go in the street. As an example, you can fill in the blanks if it doesn't quite fit. And then the checkpoint meeting should feed the annual review. So I don't believe in doing things that are not going to be used, and we don't do checkpoint meetings for the sake of doing checkpoint meetings. The checkpoint meetings are to feed the annual review, but it's not from the standpoint of, I believe this person is a mid-level player, so I'm going to back into that. No, what you're doing is that checkpoint is an opportunity for you to shoulder with them to become the best version of themselves possible within that time frame. And that's going to help their annual review. So it's not about the annual review, it's about them becoming fully competent and earning more autonomy so they have freedom of action, and then making sure that they have access to the tools and resources, which is the relatedness. And then I mentioned conditioning behavior. As I wrap up, I want to give you a key next step to begin integrating what we've covered today in your business. Throughout this webinar, we've talked about dynamic leadership, what it is, why it works, and what steps you can take to shift your leadership style for sustainable growth. But as we've seen, knowing the what and implementing the how are two very different things. That's why I want to help you take things from insight to action. I'm inviting you to take the next step by booking a 90-minute one-on-one coaching session with me. In this session, we'll work together to design your personal on-ramp to dynamic leadership in your organization, tailored specifically for your business and its unique challenges. Here's what you'll get in this powerful session: a 90-minute deep dive where we won't just talk about concepts, we'll actually do the work together, developing a customized plan that's actionable and specific to your situation. You'll get access to 3 months of exclusive live group coaching sessions where we'll continue to build on the progress that we make in our one-on-one session. These sessions will keep you on track, give you additional insights, and allow you to ask questions as you start implementing dynamic leadership. a content library of past sessions full of tools, strategies, and real-world examples to support your journey. For a modest fee of $129, you're getting not just a plan, but ongoing support and access to a community focused on growth and leadership transformation. You'll leave the session with a clear roadmap, not only what to do, but how to do it, so you can confidently take the next steps in building a leadership style that will help your business thrive. If you're ready to bridge the gap between theory and practice and implement a leadership style that grows with your business, this call is for you. Book your 90-minute session today, and let's start creating the dynamic leadership strategy that will set your business up for long-term success.